Hi, everyone. Seven Investing founder Simon Erickson here, and I'm very excited that on our first interview, I had the chance to speak with someone who's a role model and a hero to millions of people. Dr. Sandy Magnus was a former NASA astronaut. She's also served in various leadership roles in the space industry. Sandy, I'm excited to chat with you. Thank you for joining me here this afternoon.
No, thank you very much for the invitation.
Sandy, you have a very extensive resume that's very impressive because you've seen a variety of different things here on Earth, but you've also seen a variety of things from several miles above Earth as well. I have to start with the first question of what is it like in 4.5 months in the International Space Station? And is there anything you can pass along to those of us that haven't been in outer space that's truly spectacular about it?
Well, I mean, clearly the view has to be the first thing that I talk about, because those of you who have never had the good fortune to leave the planet and move to space, I basically moved to space for 4.5 months, had this beautiful view of our planet out the window every day, and really never got tired of looking out the window at our amazing Earth. And what you see when you look out the window is a beautiful, fragile planet, but you also see it as the home for all of us, and it's our spaceship. And so every astronaut that goes to space has the same impression. It's like, wow, it's just one planet. You don't see the country's boundaries. We don't see tribes. We just see one place where humans live, and it's a very profound experience.
I can believe that. And there are a lot of other people getting excited about space right now, too. We're starting to see billionaire entrepreneurs founding companies that are working on rocket ships. We have other entrepreneurs that are bringing companies public that are doing space tourism, bringing people out into outer space. I wanted to ask, what is your take on this new commercial space economy? Even with all the excitement, are there also some considerations that should be addressed right now?
Well, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that it's not easy. We still have a lot to learn as we expand both the breadth and the depth of the people that are able to have the experiences that I've had. If you think about it, it's the natural step in where we should be going as human beings with our adventures in space. We've had 50 years plus of government investment in this particular domain, if you will, or sector, right? And the purpose of government investment is to lower the barriers, do the hard technology types of efforts that companies don't want to pay for because companies have to make a profit. And so what you see right now is, after 50 years, there's a really broad and deep foundational knowledge of what it takes to launch things into space, to the point where students are launching CubeSats in college, something I never could have dreamed of when I was in school, 35 years ago. The technology's changed a lot. The amount of brain power you have on your smartphone far exceeds by orders of magnitude what the shuttle computers are capable of doing. You've got entrepreneurs who are willing to take some risks with this emerging space market or space sector, because of the first two items, there's sort of a little bit of a feel for the risk-reward equation more so than before. And the government finally is allowing all this to happen in the way that they're engaging with commercial partners to contract for services instead of just buy the car and own the car, right? So we're living in this really interesting place where all of these decades of government investment is finally paying off, but it's still the beginning of that transition. And we can't forget that it's not easy. And as we try and enlarge this scope of people that are engaging in space and create a market that's hopefully government independent someday, it's going to take a little while. It's not going to happen overnight, and we all have to be patient.
Double clicking on that point you make about the governments and how they have an interest in this. I've seen that you've worked in the past with the European Space Agency. You've worked with Japan, you've worked with Brazil, you've worked with Russia. Are there certain specific things that the international community is working together to fix or to address in outer space? And then also, how does this work with other governments having their own kind of national interests? Or even now that you've got the private sector in it that's trying to generate profits, how are we going to address getting to outer space collaboratively?
Yeah, it's a thorny question, but my experience has been mainly while I was at NASA working on the International Space Station program, and that's 16 different countries that have worked together to build this amazing outpost in space, where we've learned how to to work together. And you mentioned a lot of them: Russia, the European Space Agency with their many member nations, Japan, Canada, Brazil was there for a little while. There are a lot of other countries doing things in space as well. And there is global concern that we try and use space intelligently as a species, as collaboratively and cooperatively as possible. There's a body underneath the United Nations called the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that has been around for 50 years or so, and they discuss things like that. How can we set some standards, some best practices, some behavioral norms for the use of space as a global community, regardless of whether you go up as a confederation like we did with the space station, or as individual nations pursuing national goals. You probably hear a lot of conversations about space traffic management and space situational awareness, which has actually nothing really primarily to do with human spaceflight, but more to the point that so many countries and companies are now launching satellites of various kinds into orbit, and how do you manage that? Similar to the air traffic control system that governs how planes fly around the planet. There's actually an international body that does that, and planes don't fly randomly. There's sort of highways that have been mapped out in the sky with specific modes of communication and protocols. And so there's a lot of nations interested in establish similar kind of things for space.
There's a lot of work being done for the infrastructure of going into outer space right now.
Yes, and it's going to take some time. And just like every other formative activity, we're trying to learn as we go. And it's, of course, complicated by the fact that it's a global endeavor. And so we have a lot to learn.
Well, I want to look a little bit farther out, literally a little bit farther out, because Sandy, you were queued up for a South by Southwest panel, which South by Southwest unfortunately did get canceled this year. But I was really looking forward to hearing the topic of your presentation of the panel was on off-world civilizations and colonizing other planets. I guess I'd like to frame this question by asking, do you think that colonizing other planets will be an extension incrementally of what Earth is like? Or is it because we're starting from scratch and we don't have any infrastructure already in place, is it going to be completely different?
You know what? I think it's going to be a hodgepodge, right? Because you can imagine a colony is going to start very small. It's going to be an outpost. There'll probably be a group of people there from different countries because it's such a massive undertaking. No one country can really afford to do it themselves. And so whether that's 2 countries or 5 countries or 10 countries, it's going to be sort of a amalgamation of these different cultures that are placing themselves on this outpost. And so, of course, they'll start with what they know because that's where people start, right? We'll probably leverage a lot of knowledge from how we've run the International Space Station and how other countries that collaborate in space operate. But if you can imagine a culture that's sort of a mixture of different parts of what we have on Earth, but then they're this outpost and they're very far away and they're going to have to be dependent upon themselves to a great extent. And over time, I would expect them to evolve into a single, unique mishmash of a civilization that's different, quite different than what we have on Earth because the conditions are different. So even though it might start one way, it's certainly going to evolve into another. And I think that will be a really interesting sociological experiment to watch, right?
An engineering experience too, right? I mean, starting from scratch, we're going to build off of what we know, but the needs of a civilization will be totally different.
Yeah. Then again, you learn as you go, and can a big factor will be, can you use the resources of the place that you're colonizing? What's your logistics tail? How much are you dependent upon the Earth for your survival? These will all be factors into how the civilization evolves.
Speaking of learning as you go, Sandy, you have a bachelor's degree in physics, a master's degree in electrical engineering, and then a PhD in material science and engineering. Speaking from one engineer to another, are there technologies here on Earth that you're really excited about, that you think are really innovative?
Yeah, it's going to really help from a space exploration viewpoint. Things like 3D printing, for example, where you don't have to have such a huge logistics tail because you can manufacture things out of the raw materials that are there. You think about it, when people were exploring the planet, and Columbus sailed across the ocean, and the great seafaring endeavors that people did, they didn't have to bring oxygen. There are certain things they had to bring their own food and water, but they knew that wherever they were going, they would probably find food and water there. They could live off the land, as it were. And so technologies that allow us to recycle water and take dirty water and make it clean and for drinking, recycling in general, not wasting materials, and being very efficient about how you're reusing things or repurposing things to keep the logistics tail down, to keep the colony as independent as possible, where they're not relying on a steady stream of spacecraft from Earth to come resupply them. So anything in recycling, being able to grow food that is very energy dense, so you don't have to use an acre of land, for example, to grow lettuce for 5 people or whatever that may be. Advanced medical technology, so you can have medical officers who don't require 10 or 12 years of school, so telemedicine or really smart equipment for diagnostics. That'll be really key. I mentioned advanced manufacturing and additive manufacturing, things where you can manufacture from the materials that are there. Intelligent spacecraft who can do their own health and status monitoring, so that you don't have to pay attention to your life support system full time, but it'll report to you if it needs some work. These are the kind of technologies that will enable a colonization of other places.
And any idea how far out we are on colonizing other planets? Is this 20? I will not hold you to the date, but just from someone that's an expert in the field, how far out are we from putting a colony on Mars?
On Mars, we're probably quite some time away from a colony on Mars. It makes sense, especially as an operator, it makes sense to me to go to the moon and try some of these techniques out on the moon, which is only 3 days away, as opposed to, throwing someone in the deep part of the ocean, right where the Mars is six months away one way. And also it's not going to be cheap. It's going to cost some money, and it requires a long-term commitment. And we seem to be, in the United States especially, not able to make long-term commitments. We've got a refocus on the moon, which has happened during this administration, and generally the space community agrees that's the right thing to go do first. And then a matter of how long do you stay on the moon before you make the leap to Mars. There's some people that want to stay on the moon for a while. There's others that want to go to the moon just long enough to test out the things that we need to test out before we feel confident that we can send people to Mars. And so there's sort of a fork in the road there about agendas. And I think what makes sense is to do what we need to do at the moon, test out what we need to do in order to keep pushing that bubble outward to Mars. But while we're learning and practicing and establishing the infrastructure on the moon, we do it in such a way that the commercial community, the non-governmental community, can continue that effort as the government pushes the edge of the bubble outward towards Mars. But I think we're still a couple decades from Mars, minimum.
Well, my last question, Sandy, is our audience here at Seven Investing is individual investors, and there is a ton of headlines out there. There's a ton of information in the news media about space, but you're the expert that has lived this for decades. And so for anyone who's really interested in learning more about space or seeing how the progress is coming, what are a few things that you think that we should be paying attention to? Or also, what are a few things that you don't think are getting enough coverage right now that actually are really big steps we've taken?
Wow, there's so much going on. There's a lot of activity in this CubeSat, small sat kind of arena. From an investment viewpoint, you're really understanding what those business cases are is really important. Also, the small launcher business is coming online, because in order to launch these smaller payloads, these small satellites, you need a launch system that is there frequently, that you've got the frequency that you need. Because right now, if you're trying to launch satellite, as a small sat, you try and get a hosted ride on another vehicle, and sometimes you can't control the schedule. So having an on-demand small launch capability is going to be very important for the future. From a human spaceflight side, NASA is slowly opening the aperture on the ability to fly private citizens to the space station. And I think the big key there is developing the market for what are those things that you can do in space as a company to take advantage of the microgravity environment to create things that are useful here on Earth, or alternatively, depending upon how we, build the infrastructure to create things up in space that are useful in space. In order to enable markets, of course, you need to have frequent access. So as these commercial crew vehicles come online, and there are now abilities to get people in space at a regular cadence, that will help develop the markets there. Because when you get to microgravity and you experience it, and you're floating around in it, and you're sort of seeing firsthand how the physics changes and how the behavioral of the materials change, and if you send creative scientists and engineers up there, people are going to come up with some really clever ideas about how to utilize microgravity. But we need more access for more people. That's really the big mountain we have to climb, is getting more and more people up there. On a more social side, as we get the tourist trade up there to suborbital, and people get the views that I was able to get while I was up there, those people are going to come back and talk about it the way you hear astronauts talk about it. And some of those people have an incredible reach because they're quite well known. What that does with society, or how that excites the general population to accelerate this whole space thing. If you recall, some of the first pictures of the moon from Apollo 8, when they were sent back to Earth, spawned the whole environmental movement, right? And so now if you have more and more people experiencing this view of Earth, as I expressed earlier in the interview, you have to wonder, how is that going to ripple through society? So these are some interesting things I think people should keep an eye out for.
Definitely a lot of interesting things going on right now. And again, Sandy Magnus, former and retired astronaut with NASA, really just an expert opinion in the space industry. Sandy, it's been a real pleasure hearing your perspective on all of this. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Well, like I said, I appreciate the invitation, and keep your eye on the space industry. It's a pretty exciting place.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. We are here to empower you to invest in your future. We are 7 Investing.